I had some good questions post a video around organisational culture. So from a previous video, we talked about organisational culture being really quite important. It's basically culture you might define as the collective set of behaviours and norms, the sort of shared values that effectively drives the behaviours of the organisation. So that at some level, everyone's different. As you come together as groups of humans, we tend to then default to sort of group types, and the pervasive culture of an organisation can have a real impact on individuals and teams. And clearly, if you've got a successful organisational culture, that's going to really help energise the company. It's going to drive high performance. It's going to want people to be to remain in the organisation. So it drives things like engagement. So, and similarly, if you haven't got a great organisational culture, that can make it a very difficult place to work. It makes it hard to be motivated as an individual, as teams, and it makes it hard to then retain talent, and people don't want to stay and stick around. So organisations are interested in how do they, first of all, define what their culture is, because it's not written down on a piece of paper somewhere. It's something that has to be explored. So organisations often are challenged to really understand what their culture even is, and then really it's about saying, well, how do we in any way try and change the culture? And culture change is very, very difficult. It's like trying to push air. You can't see culture. You can see the impact of culture, but you can't really see the culture, and it is notoriously difficult to impact. So culture change, by definition, is about changing mindsets and behaviours of the collective, organisation, effectively. So in a previous video, I talked about one of the access points that you can use to sort of simplify this is to look at the level of autonomy that exists in the organisation. And I use the phrase of should, must, should, may. So effectively, must, what are the things that you must do? What are the organisational rules and the sanctions that force you to behave in a certain way, where no judgment's required, you just have to do as you're told and follow the rules. What's the shoulds then? So where is the organisational guidance saying, well, you should do this and you should do that? That's where decision making, judgment comes in, and that's where you need generally, higher capability. Anybody can follow rules, but when you have to exercise judgment, you need a higher order of sort of skill, effectively. And this is where sort of leadership becomes critical. And then the may is what you may do, and this is really how much permission the organisation extends to its population to say, okay, within guardrails, really you can do what you like within the bounds of your role and your goals and that kind of thing. And you can imagine organisations that have got a large amount of mays and very musts. Generally, they're a much more empowered, trusting organisation, and clearly the organisational context makes a big difference. So if you're in a high reliability industry where it's health and safety, or it's financial and regulatory, there'll be a lot more guardrails and musts, but there should still be plenty of shoulds and should be lots of mays. The follow-up question I got then was really to say, well, how does the culture around leadership change, and how can that also impact? And I guess my experience would be where you've got organisations that are heavily focused on the musts, and generally you'll see a lot of process. The process is often there to drive the musts. So it's a bit of a reinforcing cycle where an organisation feels like it has to mandate a lot of things. It creates a lot of process. By having process, it takes away people's ability to make judgments because there's a process to follow. And so you have this terrible sort of reinforcing cycle where the more process you have, the more must you have, the less judgment you need from people. Therefore, you basically sort of de-skill your organisation. So rather than saying, well, you decide as a leader, you say, well, no, you have to refer to policy, 6.2 alpha. So for me, what you tend to find is organisations that have got a lot of musts and a lot of heavy process are under-led and over-managed. It's bureaucratic, it's process-driven. Everyone just goes back to the rule book, and if they can't find a rule, they'll write a new rule. And there's never enough rules, so you end up with sort of huge rule books, and people still maybe don't know what to do. So I think you have to be very careful not to drive the culture towards high bureaucracy, high rule-based, low skill in terms of judgment making. What you really want is you need a certain level of management, but you want to be actually led. So rather than be over-managed and under-led, you want to be sort of led more effectively. And that's where you say, okay, we will stick to the must, the absolute minimum. So you might say we're just going to do regulatory. Anything that's the law is a must, and everything else in the organisation we might say, well, that's a should. We'll give you some guidance, but quite frankly, you're all intelligent human beings. We trust you, and we'll let you decide, because contexts change, the world's dynamic, and having a set of rigid rules isn't necessarily very helpful. So we just trust people to figure it out. And so organisations that have got more shoulds and a lot more mays tend to be less managed and more led. And certainly within dynamic contexts, so in a changing world with changing consumer and customer needs, you want to be agile, and having static rules and processes can be very difficult and can be very ineffective and say very bureaucratic. So I typically see management going with the musts and leadership going with the should and the mays. And this is where, if you're developing your leadership sort of philosophy, there's no point in trying to create highly empowered leaders who can exercise good judgment if they're in a culture of must. And vice versa, you also want to make sure that you're really clear that where you want leaders to follow the rules, and organisations sometimes flip-flop from this sort of high rule-based to this sort of almost no rules, and so there is a sense of finding a happy medium. So I hope that helps. I do think leadership, by definition, impacts culture. You change enough of the leaders, the culture will change. But similarly, you can take any leader and drop them into a culture, and very quickly they'll learn to conform to the norm. So I guess culture change by the existing leadership population is very difficult, because if you define the current culture as a problem, well, the leaders that are the incumbents have created or allowed that problem to exist. So if you are looking for leaders to lead culture change, it's often very challenging, because they have to really step back and say, okay, we've got to really dismantle the structures that we have created. And a lot of those are the heavy processes that are originally created for probably very good reasons, but when they're examined in more detail, you might find that they're no longer really necessary, but the organisation and the culture will tend to perpetuate those kind of things, even if logically there's no reason to have them. They just sort of maintain almost a life of their own. So leadership is really important about challenging culture, but also you recognise that the leaders are a product of that culture. Hope that helps.